Hello, everyone. Just hang tight while we switch over to our next panelists. Hello, everyone. My name is Majd Makbel. I am a fourth year med student here at U of M. I'm going to be the moderator for our next session, Getting Uncomfortable, How to Discuss Race, Gender, and Other Identities Within Healthcare. So get your favorite blanket, your favorite drink. This is going to be very important discussion. We have amazing panelists here. And I will just ask them to introduce themselves whenever they can, whenever their video pops on. There we go. Dr. Cejas, do you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. So my name is Diana Cejas. Pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a pediatric neurologist at the University of North Carolina and faculty at the Carolina Institute for Developmental Disabilities. Most of my clinical work centers around patients with neurodevelopmental disabilities and complex neurological and psychiatric conditions. My research focuses on the transition to adulthood for that population and really improving communication between healthcare providers and young disabled individuals, particularly disabled people of color. And I kind of like to say that I live in the disability space full time. Because I also identify as a cancer survivor, stroke survivor, and disabled doctor. I'm really happy to be here today.
Thank you. All right, Dr. Palermo.
Good day, everyone. My name is Angel Palermo. I use she, her, hers. I'm the Senior Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York City. And I'm also faculty in our medical school. I work at the intersection of diversity affairs, medical education, and community-based public health. My training is in public health. And so I come into this conversation as self-identifying as a cisgender woman, first gen, second generation Puerto Rican, and also as a lesbian. And a Mets fan, by the way, even though I live in the Bronx. So I'm here and I'm excited for this conversation.
Thank you. Lou, would you mind introducing yourself?
Hi, good morning, everybody. Unlike my two co-panelists, I am not a medical doctor, nor am I in medical school. My pronouns are he and him. I live in Houston, Texas. I identify as a queer transgender man. I spend a lot of time talking to healthcare providers about the barriers for trans and non-binary folks when they access healthcare. And I know that if we could educate medical school students that when they go off to do their residencies and their fellowships, we could actually change a lot more, because I know that this generation is probably wondering why we're not doing this rather than what do you want me to change? So I'm really happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have one more panelist, Dr. Hussein, but she's still in the OR right now, so we're going to give her a little bit of leeway, understandably, for joining us. So let's get started. I guess I will ask us the first question. It's kind of a general one. How can we become more comfortable addressing these topics with patients, peers, and learners in terms of discussing like race, gender, disability, and identity? And I will leave it up to whoever wants to go first.
I would say that the first thing that we need to do is start talking about it. I think that within medicine, there is just, I don't even know how to say, but there's always just traditionally seems to be this willingness to not want to address things, to just kind of sweep things under the rug. I think that, we can think of current events where people have maybe said or done something that was racist or otherwise discriminatory. And rather than addressing the harm that is caused when these events happen, which they happen all the time, there's just this tendency to just kind of be like, oh, we see you, we hear you, sweep the event under the rug, and then nothing is ever addressed, nothing is ever brought up. And I think that really, if we're going to talk about trying to address these issues and how medicine has been harmful to minoritized individuals, some of that is going to have to come with like this culture change. It's going to have to be like a top-down kind of a thing where it's not just the person who identifies as a minority is bringing up these issues and saying, hey, we need to address what's going on. I think that it's going to have to be where people who are at the top recognize, hey, we have this problem. We are in this system that has been perpetuating bias for as long as it's been here. Let's do something about it. Let's try to actually look and see what we're doing and see what we can't do to make things better.
I would just like to add, I think it's difficult because we hold on to this idea of a right to comfort, right? Like I don't want to make room for emotional and psychological discomfort. So I'm not going to talk about it. And therefore you maintain status quo. And I think those of us who have, we all straddle identities of privilege and oppression, right? If you're literate and you're native English speaking, right? You're sitting with identities of privilege. It brings you closer to, access to resources and power and privilege, right? But then there are several identities that many of us have that are housed in groups of oppression, and that is where we are experiencing a daily, persistent, chronic discomfort, disadvantage, you name all of those things. And so I think that absolutely I agree with Dr. Cejas is that dialogue creates an opening for stepping into the discomfort. I think it's just how not many people are equipped to set up the space for dialogue and actually facilitate using anti-oppressive techniques so that, it becomes, people confuse dialogue with a conversation or a debate or a discussion. And I think that medicine in particular, as much as I've taught in the medical school for the last 20 years, we don't teach you how to teach. Like we don't teach you how to teach. So, and yet that's like, the core function of your role is to teach, your patients about their illness, their condition, and then of course learn. So it's so ironic that, there's no accident as to why it's difficult. There's no accident as to why, there is a profound sense of resistance, avoidance, and denial. And yet those of us with marginalized identities or identities from oppressed groups that, trying to have that conversation is challenging because you're also negotiating the conditions of that environment in medicine, which makes no room for, these other ways of showing up, such as, collaboration and, conversation. And, instead, we're trying to adapt to the conditions, which is keep status quo, stay in your lane, Don't disrupt, you know, and be quiet and do your thing. And there's only one way to do this. And you deviate, there's a ripple effect that puts you at further disadvantage, pushes you further away from, you know, accessing the resources you need to be successful in this journey of the profession. So.
Yeah, that's a lot. It's hard to follow the two of you. There are a couple things that I'd like to mention, though. I think that in our society here in the United States, and by society, I generally refer to that as being white, cisgender, heterosexual, and probably Christian of some form. That is our mainstream society in the United States. And we have been taught, being raised in a white family, I was taught not to have those difficult conversations about race, sex, or religion. And I think that that's one of the reasons that we are where we are today, because we're not taught to have difficult conversations. So we don't have difficult conversations. And we're terrified, I think, as humans and in those ways of making mistakes. And so instead of putting ourselves out there with some sort of cultural humility or anything, we don't want to learn because we're terrified of making mistakes. And I think that definitely comes to doctors because of the pedestal that our society puts doctors on, that they know all and therefore their word is this. And so it creates, you know, the disconnect between doctors and patients, or doctors and even I think medical schools with that hierarchy. And so people that are entrenched in what they're doing, the doctors that have gone to medical school for a long time, don't want to learn anything new. And so one of the ways that I've learned that we can get doctors to even a CME to talk about sexual orientation or gender identity is through ethics, because it's one of the hardest CMEs that they have to get. And so it's like, but this shouldn't necessarily always be under ethics of why you want to be a good doctor and a good person. The other thing for me about medicine is that medicine also comes from that place of being around white, cisgender, heterosexual, Christian of some sort people at the top. And that is what is continuing to be taught. That is, from what I understand, the didactics are all centered around who is in the hierarchy. And so it's very hard for those of us, and I like what Dr. Palermo says, is just not just marginalized identities, but the oppressed groups, to have a conversation, because so many people don't want to hear it. And so we have to be able, that we need people in positions of power to have some sort of cultural humility. And when they don't, then we are stuck trying to continue to push and push and push. And so it puts the onus on the people in these oppressed categories to continue to have these conversations. And quite frankly, like, I'm tired, right? And when I'm pushing against a barrier, it takes a lot. And so it's very hard to get institutions to want to change, because, you know, sometimes you just get so tired as somebody is pushing against the barriers of how to do it. And so who wants to make the change? I think they both mentioned that, you know, it's got to come from the top down. And if that top doesn't want to make the change, or they think, look, we're doing this and it's the bare minimum. We have a racial D&I thing. You showed up, you checked the box, you were here for that 1.5 hours, moving on, but you don't hold them accountable, right? There's so many extra things that need to be happening within a standard operating procedures of how things happen within your institution. So it's not just a good policy, it's good actions.
Wonderful. Thank you guys all for answering that question. Next question we have is, how can we advocate for patients who may be adversely affected within the clinical setting when the system overlooks their individual needs? I guess just to make things easier, we can go in the same order. So
I think, I mean, when I'm thinking about this question, one of the first things that I'm thinking about is how we as physicians talk about patients. Specifically thinking about some of the language that we use, which is really stigmatizing. Things like, you know, a non-compliant patient, or this patient complains of this, or this patient, you know, is, even if you're thinking about even more negative words, thinking about like drug seeking and words like that. I think we need to be aware, and this sounds like such a cliche, but our words have so much power. We're already in this the difference between, doctors and patients. There's huge power dynamics that are at play. And when we're using this stigmatizing language, I think that we need to take a look at, one, who are we using this language to describe? Is this traditionally a person that, is this a person who is not white? Is this a person who is disabled? Is this a person who belongs to another kind of minority group? And take a look and see like what that means. See how we are kind of, showing our own biases in the language that we're using to describe patients. I think if we can take a look, especially, one of the things that I talk about a lot in talking about advocating for patients is ableism, and specifically thinking about all of the ways that medicine is just a really, really deeply ableist kind of a system, where disability is something that's supposed to be fixed, and if you're not fixable, something is wrong with you. I think if we can start to, again, try to individually and on a systemic basis kind of address our own biases, then, maybe we can start to realize, I could be a better patient, and I can better advocate for my patient just in not looking at them as a pathology, not looking at them as something that needs to be fixed, actually looking at them as a person and recognizing that even in these situations where maybe a patient isn't doing what I want them as a physician to do, maybe I need to come to them, talk to them, try to figure out what the situation is so that I can figure out how to best help them and get them to where it is that I think that they need to be, and also where it is that they think that they need to be. I think in thinking about those things also, there's so much of, social factors that kind of they could come into the language that we use, the situations that patients find themselves in. And I think if we can kind of separate our, drive to put patients in a box, which is usually, again, a deeply ableist and stigmatized kind of a box, maybe we can try to see if we can, actually treat the person who's in front of us and try to advocate for the things that would make them the healthiest and get them to the places that they need to be.
I just want to add that, the profession itself needs to take responsibility for how we train you in medicine. We train you to be biased and prejudicial and, quite frankly, racist in medicine, right? So, you come into medical school with your biases, conscious or unconscious, right? You've been socialized, however you've been socialized in your upbringing, to have stereotypes and particular points of view, attitudes, beliefs, and judgments. And then we leverage that by teaching you how to overutilize and utilize those stereotypes, by teaching you medicine through pattern recognition, checklists, rubrics, using clinical decision-making tools that use binary variable, demographic variables. And so we reinforce it, validate it, confirm it, and then you adapt to the environment of advancement in the field by demonstrating that you perfectionism, right? That you get nothing wrong because we teach you what to pay attention to or what to expect. So everything else you're blind to. And we've socialized you into that mindset. So that is your mental model as a medical student. And then you get rewarded because you've done well on the step in USMLE and and you're learning in the most rigid hierarchical environment next to the military, right? So that rigid hierarchical structure is bounded by power and privilege. So that mental model that we're socializing you to has become reinforced and tightened and sharpened. And so there is no accident as to why there are disparities by race, ethnicity as a result of provider bias, because you have been socialized, and that is the water you are swimming in. And it's so damn close, you can't even see it or identify it until something happens, enough to make you shake and sort of step back and reflect. And so what can you do for your patients is to stay ongoing self-interrogation. In academic medicine, we create this mindset of you, and I'm saying you as the larger you, not as an individual, to have this way of thinking that it only goes one way. This is how you move through, and you stay intellectual about it. There's no room for deep thinking and reflection and dialogue. And so that's the answer to your first question. So Within yourself, my recommendations are to stay in reflective. This is a journey. There is no destination to say, "Ooh, I'm anti-racist. Ooh, I'm anti-oppressive. Ooh, no. And even for people of color and BIPOC people, we are socialized into the same water, right? And then we internalize that oppression. And also we have internalized, supremacy around certain identities, right? I know that I have the privilege of being an able-bodied individual, and I recognize that privilege, but I also have to be responsible for how I manifest that privilege in my community and don't make room for people who are not able-bodied. So it's complex, it's fluid. So you have to stay in ongoing reflection and recognize patterns, and stay self-learned about this stuff. Don't read about what's happening in medicine, read in the other disciplines as well about these issues. I think within your clinical practice and research, I think you need to recognize and challenge white supremacy ideology. It manifests in the most insidious ways. And I'm sure Lash called it out in her keynote. I think you need to talk to patients about racism and not just race, but you need to learn how to do that. And therefore medical schools need to teach our students how to do that, right? And tap into building your capacity to understand structural competency, not just social determinants of health. Those social determinants of health were produced by structures. They didn't just pop out of nowhere. And so, we in medicine and medical education need to teach you that early and hold our educators accountable for reinforcing that knowledge and understanding throughout your training, and teach you the actual words to use to talk about, have you ever experienced discrimination based on your gender? Tell me about it. Have you experienced discrimination based on your race? Tell me about it. Have you experienced discrimination because of all these identities? What's that like? How does that impact your health? Who have you been taught that in medical school, right? And that's the missing opportunity here. And I just think in generally within your sphere of influence as a trainee, as an attending, as a whatever role you have in medicine, is to call out and challenge structural racism within your sphere of influence or control, right? And take small steps towards working towards transformational change, because change happens, but it only happens at the pace of trust, and it's slow. You got to be patient. And throughout all of this, you need to have a healing strategy in place, because we're quick to act and do and activate and advocate, but when we're not taking care of ourselves along this journey, that is the most brilliant strategy of all, because that's called burnout. And then where's the gain?
Wow, I wish I would have gone first in the very beginning, because this is getting harder and harder after you two. But a couple of the things that I jotted down while listening was, I think sometimes patients need a navigator, right? As we're talking about this with a language that is being used by our providers that we don't always understand, we don't understand systems. As somebody who lives with chronic pain, like, sometimes it's so hard just to get myself moving and everything, and then to go to the doctor and then try to understand what my next step is. Like, I need help. And where is that help? And if you start asking for help, people get really frustrated and really just like, here's your information, make that call. And it's like, oh my gosh, I don't have the energy to make that call. Oh my gosh, now I have to get from point A to point B. And they make it so difficult. And I believe they want to make it difficult because, right, they only want to see who they want to see. And it's that way where people with social economic disadvantages are continued to be pushed down and continued to be held down. And we see that in many different areas as patients, but also as who ends up in medical school, right? So if our medical school students are coming from these privileged places, whether it's able-bodied, whether it's white, whether it's whatever, from the richer kids in class, because they're more advantaged to get the better grades, to do all of these things, who's teaching who, right? And so these systems are continually perpetuated within our schools, within our institutions, as they get filtered out into our communities. And so that's also something I think we need to be thinking about as they go forward, as our students go forward. Also, I think that as Dr. Palermo says, right, if you say, have you been discriminated based on XYZ, you have to stop and listen. And how much time do our doctors give us? Like, I am so thrilled that my medical provider, my general practitioner, when she comes in, she brings her laptop and she sits and she listens. And I am more than happy to wait if my appointment is late, because I know that that means she's giving other patients the same attention that she's going to give me, and that she listens to me and says, oh, well, and if she doesn't know the answer, she looks it up on her laptop rather than expecting me to provide her with an answer. So this chronic pain that I'm talking about, I had a chronic pain doctor a couple of years ago, and I went to him and I was in so much pain, and I'm sitting there and I'm just like, I'm in pain. I'm like, I need some help. Like, something's not working. I can barely function. And he looks at me as I'm sitting there bare chested and everything. He goes, what are your scars from? And I'm like, I mean, it's all in my chart, right? I am a transgender man. I've had top surgery. In your world, it's a double mastectomy. He goes, well, can I ask you about that? And I'm like, oh my God, I'm in pain. I'm here because I need you to solve a problem. If you want to bring me back and have me educate you, I'm more than happy to, but you can pay me rather than me sitting here and paying you, right? Because that's what I'm doing. I'm paying you for your expertise. And while I'm in pain and I'm sitting here needing your expertise, you're wanting me mine. I was so frustrated, and like, I almost wanted to cry, but I needed this guy's help. I needed somebody's help that I wasn't getting. And so I think that that's something that we're always expecting those that are most marginalized. Dr. Cejas said it earlier, of those that are most marginalized to be telling us what they need. And I think that comes to another point that I've learned last fall, is like, everybody needs two mentors, one older and one younger, or one more advantaged, one less advantaged, because like, it's not always the people that are further along in their studies or in their workplace that can teach us things. Like, I'm a 50-year-old dude. I don't understand TikTok. I don't understand some of these things. I have some of my college friends that are in their early 20s that are explaining new things to me, even about language around the LGBTQ plus community, because our language evolves and changes. And if I can't keep up, who's going to teach me? Well, go get a friend who can help me learn, right? And I think that that's where doctors get stuck in their niches of, this is what I know. Nothing in this is changing. I went to a provider a couple of years ago and I was on PrEP. And so I wrote down that I was taking Truvada because, got to disclose it. She's like, oh, I didn't know you were, and she's like, I'm like, what? And she's like, well, you haven't disclosed that you're HIV positive. And I'm like, because I'm not, right? So she saw that I was taking Truvada and just automatically made an assumption based on the fact of what my drugs listed were. And so then here I am educating my doctor on what I'm taking PrEP, what Truvada and what PrEP is. And so it's that lack of willingness to learn outside, but then making those assumptions and attaching something to me based on the limited knowledge that she had. So those are just some things that I think that need to change. And I think we really need to listen to the students that are in school now over what they want versus the same thing happening over and over and over again.
Thank you all for those great answers. For those that haven't had coffee yet, I'm pretty sure that would have woken you up, all those three answers. Just a quick logistical things. When you guys are for the participants, when you guys are in the chat, make sure to put it at all panelists and attendees, so everyone watching this can also see your comments. I guess we have a question from the audience. Eric Kautz says, are there specific training modalities that would help to address bias or racism in medicine? I think many people feel that diversity computer trainings are only partially effective. I was wondering if there is a way to train that produces more uncomfortable, more challenging, and more memorable environments safely. And Lou, you want to take this one first?
I'm not a doctor. I don't know your modalities.
That's fine.
So I'll defer to the other two. Thank you.
I'll try to answer this question because it's I think in medical education this is a very new space for medical education to create a learning and training environment that that can achieve this. And it's super challenging because when you think about setting up the conditions for such an environment to learn in, you have to think about the students, the content, like who's teaching, when you're teaching it, how you're teaching it, and where you're teaching it, as Lou shared earlier. And so those modalities, and so remember, physicians aren't trained to teach, and they're not teaching with a pedagogy in mind, right? And this is where we need to step into other disciplines and invite them into medicine to transform the learning environment. So one of the things that we are, we've been working on this at Mount Sinai for the last 5 years, right? How do we actually transform the learning environment so that it is an anti-racist, anti-oppressive learning environment? And the lift to do that is huge, because you have to understand that there's resistance, massive resistance, because physicians, and particularly the old guard of doctors, right? You have this mindset, and there's like there's only one way to teach. This is how we teach this because I was taught this. And that apprentice model is like so deeply embedded in the way you teach and learn medicine. And so undoing that is a threat. And so now it's about, well, how do we actually bring in, how about we bring in, anti-racist educators, racial equity scholars, people who know how to teach in this space, folks who are trained in critical race theory, anti-oppressive frameworks, and convene them with the content experts in science and medicine, and actually redesign the curriculum together. While equipping faculty with the techniques and teaching practices. One of the things we started doing now is actually doing faculty development around anti-oppressive facilitation techniques, right? Because there's a ton of small group learning. There is teaching at the bedside. There is rounding. There's all these small group micro learning environments that happen in your training, and the attendings, the residents, the faculty, the preceptors are not necessarily equipped to how to facilitate those moments to ensure that everyone has a voice, that all points of view being considered, that there is a thinking towards the greater solution of the patient, et cetera, and disrupting the loudmouth, the one who always wants to be right, just disrupting all of that. So I think this is it's a wicked question, which I appreciate. And there is no specific answer, because I think the various medical schools are beginning to generate different strategies, and we have to pull in the other disciplines outside of medicine to actually do this work, because we can't do it alone in medicine.
Sorry, my cat is like scratching a bunch of stuff. I was trying to get her to get her to stop before I answered. But yes, I mean, I totally, just to kind of piggyback on that, when I was in residency, after multiple instances of various microaggressions and other things, which I can't get into at this period of time, one of the things that I recognized was, we didn't have this education, we don't have this training in my particular training program. So what some of my co-residents and I did was we created a curriculum that was based around these things. But again, thinking about what Dr. Palermo was saying, we don't teach people how to teach. We ended up, consulting with people outside of our department, people outside of the School of Medicine, to kind of help us figure out what it was. Because we thought that we knew what we wanted as trainees, the education that we wanted to receive, but weren't quite sure how to get that education, where to go to get it. So we ended up talking to a bunch of people in medicine, outside of medicine, in schools of education, to try to figure out how to develop our own curriculum. It was very much for the program that we were in the city that we were in, and also specifically kind of as a response to some of the micro and macro aggressions that we were personally receiving. I think it would be lovely if there were, these kinds of big national or even international training programs against bias and racism and ableism and all of those isms. But I feel like some of the work is going to have to be at this kind of small local level, because there are so many different experiences. Every program has its own kind of flavor and various things that, yes, certainly, we should be, trainees and faculty should be taught about like major biases, all kinds of things. But then you've got your own little cultural subsets within your communities, within the communities that you're serving, and you need to learn a little bit more nuance. So again, I would love to know if there are any of these bigger training programs. One of the things that I'm having, an issue with now as junior faculty is, thanks to 2020 and everything that has come up as a result of that, now, even within my department where I am faculty, we're having more conversations about these things, and people are like, I want to take some anti-racism classes. I want to take some anti-bias classes. And it's like, yeah, okay, yes, that would be nice. But we also need to do some more learning and consulting with people who can kind of teach us how to really learn and better approach these kinds of issues.
Hey, I'd like to make one comment. I'm not in medical school, but one of the things that I've noticed is that because I talk on LGBTQ issues, if students are getting topics, conversations, classes, they're always electives, which means you're only opting in if you care. You're not learning this because you need to learn it, because I guarantee you, no matter what your specialty is, you are going to see queer patients somewhere, somehow. And if you don't have that knowledge, that trust that needs to be there between patient and provider is never going to be done, because you're not going to ask the right questions, or you're going to say something that is triggering, so I'm not going to come out. And I think one of the things that providers need to be doing is thinking about whole health, right? As a 50-year-old queer trans guy who predominantly sleeps with men, who lives with diabetes, major depression, anxiety, and chronic pain, right? My whole world needs to function together in order for me to get out of bed. And if one of those things are off, I'm probably in my pillow fort just hanging out, right? And so everything needs to be learned. And when people are allowed to opt out of these other things, whether it's a class on race, whether it's a class on LGBTQ issues, that makes it, that it continues to other those marginalized and oppressed positions. And so how do they, I think what really needs to happen for our future medical doctors, providers, is we need to revamp the curriculum that is happening within our medical schools so that these things aren't taught as something that is there. And I battle this. I live within walking distance of the world's largest medical center. There are 3 medical schools within a 15-mile radius and one about 45 minutes down the road. And the way that that curriculum is being taught in those 4 medical schools is vastly different, even though 2 of them belong to the same system. And here in Texas, I think all but 2, we have 6, I believe we have 16 medical schools, and all but 2 belong to the exact same system. Actually, I think 3 now. And those 3 are private. 2 of them are private. One is whatever. Even the ones within the same system, the same big state system, don't have the same curriculum. They don't follow the same modalities. So if you go to, it's the University of Texas, and if you go to the University of Texas Medical School within Houston versus the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston or San Antonio or anywhere else, it's not the same. And that is so frustrating that when you're talking about people that have marginalized identities are having to push up against, where do I go to get the best education and what is it based on? There is so much to compete with, right? So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Lou. So we have one more question, or a few more questions. I guess you already touched on this a little bit about how Dr. Palermo talked about not just reading or about reading and self-reflecting, but how do we change this on a systematic level? Lou, you talked about standardizing it, making it part of the curriculum, not making it opt out or opt in. I was wondering if Dr. Palermo and Dr. Cejas have anything else to add to that.
The answer is not, do this, do this, do this. I can't give you an answer like that. I've been at Mount Sinai for 21 years in diversity affairs. the last 5 years has been the most exciting part of my career at Mount Sinai, because there has been a pivot to go beyond diversity, equity, and inclusion, really diversity. You know, diversity in my mind, I know it's in my title, it's the space that I occupy in the academic medicine, but it exists because of racism. So like, that's not lost on me. And yet in the last 5 years, it's been, the pivot has been, let's actually confront this and talk about it. And I have to say that we have been at changing the water, and I'm going to refer the system as the water, right? The culture we're all swimming in. It has been 5 years of chipping away at changing the system. And so, and that has taken multiple kinds of multiple people, students, faculty, leadership, and everyone has a different level of readiness to engage in this space. And some are still managing their resistance, even when it's like, it's not obvious, it's a hidden resistance. And so, you know, I just want to really just say that, you know, wherever you are in this learning environment, because it is hierarchical, pay attention, maintain a critical consciousness, pay attention to how the system works. You know, even if you're someone with, you know, as a BIPOC individual and you are witnessing or experiencing specific events of microaggressions, macro assaults, all of those terms through the lens of race or through the lens of gender or ability, disability, pay attention to the patterns and the trends, right? And pay attention to the structures or the conditions or the policies or the practices that enable those patterns and trends to happen. Those structures, what COVID did, COVID revealed the system onto itself. COVID said, yeah, well, here's COVID, and then boom, racial injustice is parallel pandemics, revealed the system onto itself and showed us what the structures are and that exist and don't exist. That's why there's no accident as to what we're seeing, because we're seeing the system now at play. And so pay attention to what's at play with regards to this layer of structures, because then you want to think about, well, who's responsible for the structures? Who's responsible for the policies and practices that are at play? Who's responsible for setting up these conditions? And when you think that through, it's about, well, what's the mental model that's happening right now? And, you know, I tried to articulate that earlier, that it's really deeply embedded in a sort of paternalistic, perfectionistic, individualistic mental model. So there's no access to why the structures are the way they are. There's no access to why your learning environment is the way it is. Because those who have positional power designing that have a particular mental model and mindset that is deeply rooted and informed by norms and values and cultural norms of the profession called medicine. And so to change all of that, it's going to be incremental, and it needs persistent, consistent, critical analysis wherever you are along the professional journey and hierarchy. And it requires being able to understand the systems, have a systems thinking lens. It's not just what's happening in front of you. It is all, there's no accident why disparities continue to persist, because someone is benefiting from it. Someone's benefiting from health disparities. And there are various entities. So when you deconstruct that, you can reveal the system onto itself, because you know, when you see something, you can't unsee it, or when you know it, you cannot unknow it. That's what's happening. And so I invite you to develop a critical consciousness lens as a strategy to begin systems change through your various spheres of influence and control.
Thank you, Dr. Oh, sorry, Dr. Cejas.
No, go ahead.
Dr. Hussein has joined us. Thank you, Dr. Hussein, for making the time for us. If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself first.
Hi, everyone. Sorry I'm late to the conference. I'm post-call and had a very big trauma call night. Hi, Dr. O. I'm a trauma and critical care surgeon practicing in Florida, or I was practicing in Florida. I'm in Arizona right now. I am not your typical surgeon, not white male, made very well aware of that throughout my training. And And so I'm also a mother of 6 whom I've had all of them during my training, intern year, second year, 4th year, chief year twin, fellowship baby. And those are other reasons why I was told not the typical surgeon, but I use all the experiences in getting to where I am today to point out that, I'm sorry, I joined late, but the speaker who went before me, that it's an entire system that is that we operate in that is designed to exclude us. So while we say we want diversity, equity, and inclusion, the very systems in which we operate are designed to keep diversity out. So, yeah, not inclusive.
Thank you, Dr. Hussein. So we only have 5 more minutes left. I want to get to one more question I think is a very important one. As a minoritized provider, how do you balance the minority tax when often expected to educate peers and colleagues on this? How do you not burn out or how do you draw boundaries in this work?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question again? You dropped off.
Yeah, sorry. As a minoritized provider, how do you balance the minority tax when often expected to educate peers and colleagues on this? How do you not burn out and how do you draw boundaries in this work?
So, I've spent a lot of time and energy over the years trying to, really take on that minority tax of educating everyone around me to make sure that they are comfortable with my presence or comfortable with the presence of patients who we serve, that who are not treated equitably. So I've transitioned over the years to focus more on changing the system from within, as far as addressing policies, addressing shortfalls within our care of patients, and giving more attention to that than educating a single person. So I think it's important for us to realize that, you may educate 1 or 2 people, and a lot of times they question your experience. They question whether your feelings of being mistreated or being discriminated against are real. So and that gaslighting takes extra toll on you, and so I personally feel that, and this I teach all my minoritized students and residents, is that we don't have to take on the burden of other people's ignorance. If you have people who are actively resistant to change or to see your experience as real, then they are not deserving of our attention and our emotional labor. So one of the things that I focus on is, how do we change policies to make sure that, yes, I may be going through this emotional labor, but the next person who follows me will not have to face that. So I've, focused a lot on changing policies when it comes to, wearing a hijab in the operating room. Every hospital I've ever been in has had a problem with that. So, we went above the hospitals and went to the AORN, which is the Association of OR Nurses, who write guidelines for all hospitals to follow, to change the policy to say it's discriminatory that you keep certain people out of the operating room because they happen to wear a hijab. Within hospitals, our pain management regimens, we look at how do we treat patients equitably. So instead of focusing on one individual provider who may be mistreating patients, you look at the entire system. So I think if we focused our emotional labor and energy in educating people who just may not know better, I think it's worthwhile for us to take that energy and put it into something that is going to be more effective, more helpful for our personnel who are minoritized, as well as our patients who are being treated inequitably.
Thank you, Dr. Hussein. If anyone else would like to add in, I know Dr. Palermo, you have to head out soon. So if you want to take this one before you go. All right. Well, all right. I guess we could go to the next question. So this is one is, as a third year student, it's difficult to call out racism or gender bias in the clinical space because of the power hierarchy. You never know how an attending or resident will take this feedback or report it in your evaluation. Given that this hierarchy and the ethos of professionalism creates a conservative space that stifles change, how can we transform these inherent models of learning?
I'll say a little bit about, I'll respond to that just from experience at our institution. You know, we are where we are as a medical school in addressing racism and bias in the learning environment because of our students. They organized both our Black and brown students and our white students. You know, it was a cross section of students led by Black and brown voices. And I'll never forget, it was the first time I heard the term anti-racism. They formed the Anti-Racism Coalition and had data. And so what they did was they requested a meeting with the leadership of the school, and they knew exactly who they were talking to. And they presented it like it was like a grand rounds. It was literally an academic presentation. They presented the problem. They had data to back it up. They had high anecdotal evidence. They had they did survey data. They had examples from the courses of slides, of quotes. They had documented evaluation data, and they laid it out. And they said, this is what's so. What's so is that you are actually training us to and priming us to be biased in these ways. And so we're sharing the problem, and here are potential pathways of solutions that we would like to create together or ask you to take on, since this is your job, right, as educated leadership, that this has to change. And so you could not see that and not respond. And as an we responded in a reaction, defensiveness, right? We got defensive and we were like, no, that can't be, right? Because it was disrupting our right to comfort of like being right. We know what we're doing. We're trained medical educators. No, actually, guess what? And you know what did that? Is because we're a medical school that practices holistic review. We bring in a diverse group of students into our medical school. We have the words activist and advocate and catalyze change in our mission statement. And then you want it to be convenient on how they advocate and call out the system? No, it doesn't work that way. We brought in this group of students year after year. We deemed them acceptable to be a student here, and then they call it out. No. So we got defensive. We had to move through that, and then we moved towards, okay, let's actually figure out how to create transformational change. And so, you know, I just say that it unfortunately in those environments that are deeply conservative and holding on to the tradition, it is the burden on the student. You know, it wasn't diversity affairs. We couldn't call it out. Now, behind the scenes, we'll help them out and strategize, but we couldn't call it out. And so the other piece is that the students worked with allies in other medical schools. They also worked through the national platforms, whether it was SNMA, OSR, other, you know, White Coats for Black Lives, and they rallied and created external pressure points. And unfortunately, that was the only way it worked.
Yeah, just kind of adding to that and thinking about, you know, doing things on an individual level. I'm thinking about, you know, going back to the evaluation thing and having negative evaluations or evaluations that you think are inherently, you know, racist or biased in some way. And I mean, I dare say that probably all of us on this panel have had something like that happen to us in the past. But thinking about an experience that I had with an attending where it was a pretty racist evaluation, one of those definitely dog whistly kind of evaluations where I knew what was going on. The person probably knew what was going on, but if you look at the evaluation, you can have plausible deniability. And one of the things that I did was, just as Dr. Palermo was speaking about, was I found an ally. It was an attending that I trusted. This was another attending who was another Black woman. Talked about my experiences and tried to figure out exactly what I could do within the system in which I worked, which was a deeply conservative institution, to really just protect myself and, protect myself from that other attending, also protect myself and continue to be able to make progress in my environment. And thanks to her, I mean, this is kind of where the idea for our cultural competency and anti-racism, although we didn't quite call it that at that point, curriculum, that seed was kind of planted then. And I worked with her, and through, working with that attending and getting connected with other Black and Latino women that were in the organization where I was, I kind of had this, it was like a mentorship, also kind of a safety net, safe space for me, that I was kind of also able to connect some of my friends who were other Black and Brown residents, and we were able to kind of come together, develop this project. And we took it to our program directors, our leadership. We were saying, this is something that we need. But, it really didn't get as far as it probably could have until we had that buy-in, until we could say, yes, we have attendings that are here. Yes, these are people who have position, who have power in the institution. These are people who think that they believe in what we're trying to do. And then we could really try to make changes, on our little microsystems level and try to make bigger changes. But I really don't think that we would have gotten anywhere if we didn't have the protection of people who were farther up the food chain than we were. And then, even thinking about it now, trying to find allies, both within my department, within the School of Medicine, outside of the School of Medicine, and then really making sure that you've got to, I mean, it's terrible to say that, like, you have to have allies who are have enough power in the institution to really make these changes, but you really, really have to do that. And thinking about some of the things that we've been working on at my institution now, I think, again, probably we would not have had, much success with any of the DEI efforts that we're working on now without having these people who are, these high level, endowed chairs, have all this power to say, oh yes, we believe in you. But of course, they wouldn't necessarily believe in what we're doing if we didn't have those, one, personal relationships, and then two, the data to back up what it is that we're saying.
Thank you, Dr. Cejas. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to thank you guys all for joining us this morning and spending time with us. It was definitely a great experience, great words, great lessons learned from all of you. I hope we all carry it with us going forward, especially as we become those higher ups wherever we go, to be those allies for everyone else. Thank you again. The code there's like this code for attending this session. It's uncomfortable is good. After this, we have our poster presentation, and that will feel free to go to the attendees to go there and browse around, see what posters speak to you. And the other panel after that will start at 11 a.m. So thank you guys all, and have a wonderful morning and enjoy the conference.
Hi, everyone. Just to answer a couple questions that have been coming in order to access the poster session, please log into your profile on the Socio account, and then you can go down to our poster hall where you'll be able to view our 80+ posters that we have from amazing presenters all over the country. Make sure to engage with them via the chat function and ask them any questions or comment, and our presenters know to be monitoring that and engaging with you back as well. If you have any questions about the poster session and you're hanging out in here, you can feel free to ask it in the chat as well. Thank you, everyone.
Feel free to stay on this Zoom until 11. The next panel will start at 11 here. Otherwise, the link to the Zoom is through the Socio account or through the email that we've sent earlier this morning. Thank you all. Please go check out our posters from our wonderful attendees and presenters. Thank you.